A researcher at Northwestern University tracked the financial outcomes of about 2,000 Americans over a 30-year period. By the time the subjects hit their mid-40s, the top 1% of outcomes didn't belong to the highest earners. They belonged to the people who had made a handful of specific structural decisions, mostly before 40, and then let time do the rest. No more income, not better timing. A different set of moves, made in the right order. Most people assume the gap between financial stress and financial stability is about how much you earn. That assumption feels logical. It also happens to be wrong. The data consistently shows that income rank and wealth rank are two separate lists, and most people climbing one are barely moving on the other, which raises a question worth sitting with. If income isn't what separates the outcomes, what does? It comes down to a small number of decisions that compound differently from everything else. Not better budgeting, not a higher salary. Specific structural moves that change the trajectory. And 40 is roughly the last checkpoint where making them still gives you enough time for the math to work in your favor. That's what this video is about. Every year you go past that window without them. The gap between where you are and where you could be gets harder to close. My name is Alex, and if you've ever felt like you're doing everything right and the math still doesn't add up the way it should, consider subscribing, because the issue is almost never effort, and I'm going to show you exactly which moves create separation at 40, and why the sequence they happen in matters as much as the moves themselves. Once you understand the structure behind the top outcomes, you stop wondering why you're behind and start seeing precisely what to change. The reason most people miss these moves isn't that they're complicated. It's that almost everyone is watching the wrong scoreboard, and that's exactly where this starts. Here's something that sounds obvious until you actually think about it. Every financial decision you make is either growing your net worth or shrinking it. There is no neutral move. The coffee, the car lease, the apartment upgrade. Each one is a vote. The problem isn't that people make bad votes. The problem is that most people aren't watching the right scoreboard to know which way their votes are going. And that scoreboard has a name. It's called your net worth. Most people track income. That's the number they negotiate, celebrate, and compare. A raise feels like progress. A higher salary feels like an arrival. But income only measures what flows through your hands. Net worth measures what stays. Those are not the same thing, and confusing them is one of the most expensive mistakes a person can make across a 40-year career. Here's a concrete way to see it. Take two people, a project manager named Daniel and a teacher named Claire. Daniel earns $110,000 a year. Claire earns $72,000. By every conventional measure, Daniel is ahead. But Daniel upgraded his apartment every time he got a raise, bought a new car on a 5-year loan, and increased his spending almost in lockstep with his income for the better part of a decade. Claire kept her expenses flat, put the difference into index funds, and didn't touch it. At 40, Daniel has a nicer lifestyle and about $31,000 saved. Claire has a net worth north of $280,000. Same city, same decade, two completely different financial positions. And the gap had almost nothing to do with what either of them earned. That gap has a name too: lifestyle inflation. And here's what makes it so difficult to catch. It doesn't feel like a mistake when it's happening. It feels like a reward. You worked hard. You earned more. You should be able to enjoy it. That logic is not wrong. The problem is the biology underneath it. When you upgrade your lifestyle, new apartment, nicer car, better restaurants, your brain adapts to the new level in roughly 3 months. After that, the upgrade stops feeling like a luxury. It becomes the baseline, the thing you need just to feel normal. So the next raise doesn't feel like an opportunity to get ahead. It feels like permission to upgrade again. This is how people end up earning more than they ever imagined and still feeling financially stuck. The treadmill gets faster. The scenery never changes. Now, some people hear this and think the answer is to stop spending on anything enjoyable. That's not what this is about. The distinction isn't between spending and not spending. It's between spending that raises your floor permanently and spending that you actually control. A vacation you save for and pay cash for doesn't change your baseline. A lease payment you're locked into for 5 years does. One is a choice. The other becomes a commitment you have to meet every single month, regardless of what else changes in your life. The shift that actually moves the needle is simpler than most people expect. It's a question, not the question most people ask when they're considering a purchase, which is, can I afford the monthly payment? But a different one entirely. Does this move my net worth forward or backward? That's it. That single question, applied consistently, changes the entire architecture of how you make financial decisions. It forces you to look at a purchase not as a monthly cost, but as a position, something that either builds your financial standing or erodes it. Daniel never asked that question. Claire did. That's most of the explanation. Now, shifting the question you ask is the foundation. But a question alone doesn't build anything if the structure underneath it isn't stable. And for a lot of people in their 30s and 40s, the structure has a specific kind of crack running through it, one that's quietly expensive in ways that don't show up obviously on a monthly budget. Understanding that crack is what makes everything else in this video actually work. And it all comes down to what most people think of as a grade, but is actually something much closer to a foundation, what we're calling the unbreakable defense. Nobody goes broke from one bad month. That's not how financial collapse actually works. It happens slowly, through structures that quietly drain value in the background, while everything on the surface looks fine. The salary comes in, the bills get paid, life continues, and somewhere underneath all of it, a set of invisible costs compounds in the wrong direction for years before anyone notices. Two of those costs matter more than almost anything else at this stage of life, and most people are carrying both of them right now without fully understanding what they're actually costing. The first one is consumption debt. There's a useful distinction that doesn't get talked about enough. Acquisition debt, a mortgage, a business loan, something that generates income or builds an asset, can be a legitimate tool. It's debt in the service of accumulation. Consumption debt is the opposite. Credit cards, car loans, buy now, pay later balances. These are debt in service of spending that's already happened. The asset is gone. The payment remains. The average credit card interest rate in the United States is currently sitting at around 21%. That number sounds high in the abstract. Run it through actual math, and it becomes something else entirely. Take someone like Marcus, a graphic designer carrying $20,000 across 2 credit cards. He pays the minimum each month, figures he'll deal with it properly when things loosen up. Here's what actually happens. At 21% interest, making only minimum payments, Marcus will spend roughly 23 years paying off that balance. By the time it's cleared, he will have paid over $42,000 in interest alone on a $20,000 debt, more than double. That's not a debt. That's a subscription to a penalty, one that charges him every single month for a decision he made years ago. And the brutal part is that the $42,000 doesn't disappear. It goes directly to the lender. It does not build an asset. It does not grow. It just leaves. Permanently. That's the first crack in the foundation. The second one is subtler and in some ways more expensive, because it affects every major financial transaction for the rest of your life. Most people think of their credit score the way they think of a grade in school, something that determines whether you pass or fail, whether you get approved or rejected. That framing misses almost everything that matters. Your credit score is a pricing mechanism. It determines not whether you can participate in the financial system, but how much you pay to do so, every single time, for decades. Here's the number that makes that concrete. The current average rate on a 30-year mortgage is around 6.5%. The spread between a strong credit profile and a weak one can easily be a full percentage point or more. On a $500,000 loan, the difference between a 6% rate and a 7% rate is approximately $112,000 over the life of the loan, not per year. Total, $112,000 for the same house, the same bank, the same loan amount, just priced differently based on a 3-digit number you built or neglected over the previous decade. That is not a small difference. That is years of your working life extracted quietly through a rate you accepted because you didn't have the score to negotiate it lower. Building and protecting an 800 credit score before 40 isn't about financial vanity. It's about what it costs you to live in the modern economy. Every mortgage, every car loan, every business line of credit, all of it gets priced against that number. The higher it is, the less you pay just to participate. And then there's the third piece of the foundation, the one that doesn't generate returns, doesn't compound, and doesn't do anything impressive at all, but without it, everything else in this plan is one unexpected event away from unraveling. 6 months of expenses, in cash, sitting somewhere boring. Not because emergencies are inevitable, because options are expensive, and this is how you afford them. A sudden job loss, a medical bill, a car that dies at the wrong moment, Without that cushion, any one of these forces a bad decision. You take the wrong job because you need the paycheck. You carry a balance because there's no alternative. You sell an investment at the wrong time because the rent is due. The emergency fund doesn't make you money. What it does is protect every other financial decision you make from being made under pressure. And making decisions under pressure is one of the most reliable ways to end up back at the beginning. With the floor stable, the conversation shifts, because defense only takes you so far. At some point, the question isn't how to stop losing ground. It's how to start gaining it faster than a standard salary allows. And that means taking a hard look at something most people accept without questioning: the built-in ceiling on what a paycheck can actually pay you. Think about the last time someone got a raise and felt genuinely, lastingly better about their financial position. Not the week after, not the first paycheck, 6 months later. Most people, if they're honest, would struggle to point to one. The raise came, life adjusted, the feeling faded, and they were back to the same underlying question: how do I actually get ahead? That's not a spending problem. That's a structural problem. Here's what a salary actually is. It's an agreement between you and an organization that says your time and output are worth a specific number. A number set not by the market, but by a budget that was approved before you walked in the room. Your manager may like you. Your performance review may be excellent. But the ceiling on what you can earn inside that structure was already decided by people who have never met you, based on headcount projections made months ago. And for most people in their 30s, it's the invisible constraint running underneath every other financial plan they make. The question worth asking is not how to push harder against that ceiling. It's how to build something that doesn't have one. That starts with what this framework calls skill leverage. The idea is straightforward. Most careers reward depth, getting very good at a specific thing. But depth alone, in most fields, hits a ceiling of its own. The people who break through it are the ones who combine rare technical depth with what you might call multiplier skills. Communication, the ability to explain complex ideas simply. Sales, not in the used car sense, but in the sense of being able to move people toward a decision. The ability to write clearly and persuasively. These skills don't replace the technical depth, they amplify it. A software engineer who can also walk a room of non-technical executives through a product decision and get alignment is not twice as valuable as one who can't. In most organizations, that person is 5 to 10 times more valuable because they can do what the technical expert cannot, which is translate the work into outcomes other people will fund. Consider someone like Priya, a data analyst at a mid-sized logistics company. She was excellent at her job, genuinely one of the best in her department. For 4 years, she received solid reviews, modest raises, and watched her ceiling stay exactly where it was. Then she spent 8 months deliberately learning how to present data to business audiences. Not just charts and numbers, but the narrative behind them. What the numbers meant for the decisions the leadership team was already trying to make. Within a year of making that shift, she was being pulled into executive briefings, then strategy sessions. She didn't change industries. She didn't get a new degree. She added one layer to what she already did well. Her income over the following 3 years increased by 63%. That's not an inspiring anecdote. That's a demonstration of how leverage actually works inside a career. Now, there's a second piece to this that gets dismissed as lifestyle spending, but is actually something different. Tools that remove friction from high-value work are not luxuries. They are infrastructure, a faster laptop, a proper monitor setup, software that automates the repetitive parts of skilled work. These things don't make you feel more productive. They make you measurably more productive, which means the same hours produce more output, which means your effective hourly rate goes up without your employer needing to approve anything. The frame to hold on to is this: career capital built in your 30s is the asset that starts compounding differently in your 40s. The skills, the reputation, the network, the leverage, none of it shows up on a balance sheet, but all of it determines how much your time is worth in the open market. 1 hour of highly leveraged effort eventually produces what 10 hours of unlevered effort cannot. That's not a motivational line. That's just the math of how value accumulates in skilled work. But skill leverage and better tools still operate inside the same fundamental structure. You produce, someone pays you, and you exchange time for income. That trade has a ceiling no matter how good you get at it. Breaking through that ceiling entirely requires a different kind of move. It requires shifting from being paid for your time to owning a piece of the outcome. And that shift is what separates the people who do well from the ones who build something that actually compounds. That's the ownership shift, and it's where the real separation happens. There is a version of financial progress that looks correct from the outside and quietly fails on the inside. Good salary, consistent saver, reasonable lifestyle. Everything is running the way it's supposed to run, and yet the trajectory never really bends. The line goes up, but gradually, predictably, in a way that feels more like maintenance than momentum. Most people in that position assume they need to optimize harder, spend less, earn a little more, find a better fund. What they actually need is a different kind of move entirely. The distinction that changes everything is this: a salary pays you for time you've already spent. Equity pays you for value that hasn't been created yet. Those are not two versions of the same thing. They produce completely different financial trajectories over a working lifetime, and most people spend their entire career on the first track without ever stepping onto the second. This is what the ownership shift actually means. Not quitting your job, not gambling on crypto. It means finding exposure to upside that isn't capped by what someone else's budget can accommodate. And the entry point for most people isn't dramatic. It starts with what investors call asymmetric risk. An asymmetric bet is one where the downside is limited and the upside is not. You can lose a defined amount, some time, some money, some energy, but the ceiling on what you gain doesn't exist in the same way. Starting a side project in your area of expertise, building an audience around a skill you already have, joining an early-stage company for a below-market salary plus equity, taking a consulting contract alongside your main job. These aren't moonshots. They're structured bets where the worst case is bounded and the best case is genuinely open-ended. Most people avoid them anyway, because uncertainty feels like danger, and a salary feels like safety. That framing is understandable. It's also exactly backwards. A salary provides certainty of income and a ceiling. An asymmetric bet provides uncertainty of income and uncertainty of ceiling, which sounds worse until you realize that a ceiling is the problem you're trying to solve. Take someone like Brendan, a marketing director at a healthcare company, earning $115,000 a year. Solid career, respected in his field. He spent 2 years building a newsletter on the side, Healthcare Marketing Strategy, written for small clinic operators who couldn't afford a full agency. He didn't quit his job. He didn't raise money. He spent maybe 6 hours a week on it for the first year, mostly on evenings and weekends. By month 22, the newsletter had 4,000 subscribers and 2 sponsorship partners. He packaged his consulting framework into a course. In the 12 months that followed, the side project generated $88,000, on top of his salary. He didn't double his income by getting a better job. He built a second income stream with a fundamentally different structure, one he owned. That's the ownership shift in practice. Now, the mathematical proof that this works at scale is a concept called coast FIRE. That stands for financial independence. Retire early. Coasting means you've reached a specific number invested in the market, where compound growth alone carries you to full retirement without another dollar added. Here's how that number works. If your annual expenses in retirement are $80,000, your full retirement target is $2 million. That's 25 times your annual spending, based on the 4% withdrawal rule. Your Coast FIRE number at 40, assuming 7% average annual returns and 25 years until retirement at 65, is approximately $368,000 invested today. If you have that amount sitting in the market right now, you could stop contributing entirely, and the math still gets you to $2 million by retirement. Compound growth does the rest. $368,000 is not a small number, but it is a knowable number, a specific target, not a vague direction. And the ownership shift, equity, asymmetric bets, building things you own, is what makes reaching it on a realistic timeline possible for someone who isn't inheriting anything. Here's the part that doesn't get said enough, though. None of this matters if the foundation beneath it gets knocked out. You can hit every milestone in this video and still end up in a genuinely difficult position if you haven't protected what you've built. And the risks that tend to do the most damage are rarely the ones people plan for. That's exactly what we need to look at next. What quietly destroys it all, and how to make sure your financial future is protected. Most people think about wealth protection the way they think about car insurance. Necessary, vaguely annoying, something you set up once and try not to think about again. That framing is understandable. It's also the reason a lot of people who do everything else right still end up in genuinely difficult positions, not because their plan failed, but because nothing was in place to protect it when something outside the plan happened. And something always happens outside the plan. The first asset most people forget to protect isn't in their portfolio. It's the machine generating everything in their portfolio. Your body, your health, your ability to show up and produce. Every number in the previous sections, the net worth target, the coast fire calculation, the ownership shift, assumes that you remain capable of working, building, and earning. Remove that assumption, and the entire plan changes shape. Medical bankruptcy is currently the leading cause of personal bankruptcy filings in the United States. Not bad investing, not overspending. Medical events, a single serious health episode, a cardiac event, a cancer diagnosis, a major injury, can simultaneously eliminate income and generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in costs, even with insurance. The financial case for maintaining your physical health isn't about aesthetics or discipline. It's about protecting the income-generating asset that funds everything else. Mobility work, strength training, consistent sleep, annual checkups. These are not lifestyle choices. They are doing maintenance on the machine. Now, beyond physical health, there are 3 protection moves that belong in place before 40, and most people have either skipped them or done them wrong. The first is term life insurance. If anyone depends on your income, a partner, children, aging parents, the question isn't whether you need coverage, it's whether you have enough. The standard guidance is 10 to 12 times your annual household expenses. If your household runs on $80,000 a year, you're looking at coverage somewhere between $800,000 and $960,000. Most people who have life insurance are carrying far less than that, often a policy through their employer that's 1 or 2 times their salary, which sounds like something until you run the math on what it actually needs to replace. A $200,000 payout to a family running on $80,000 a year buys roughly 2.5 years. That's not protection. That's a delay. Term life is also significantly cheaper than most people expect, especially if you're in reasonable health and you lock in a rate before 40. A healthy non-smoker in their late 30s can often secure a 30-year term policy at $900,000 of coverage for somewhere in the range of $50 to $80 a month. The window where that rate is still accessible closes as you age. Every year you wait, the premium goes up, and the health requirements get more scrutiny. The second move is basic estate planning, a will, a power of attorney document, a healthcare directive. Most people in their 30s and 40s don't have these in place because the whole exercise feels morbid and distant. Here's the practical consequence of skipping them. Without a will, the state decides how your assets are distributed, according to a formula that may have nothing to do with what you actually wanted. Without a power of attorney, if you're incapacitated, no one has legal authority to manage your finances or make medical decisions on your behalf, even a spouse, until a court appoints someone. That process takes time and money and happens at exactly the moment when time and money are already under pressure. The third move is one that almost nobody talks about until it's urgent. Think of it as the 70-40 rule. When your parents hit 70 or you hit 40, whichever comes first, it's time to have a direct conversation about their financial situation, their savings, their insurance, their plan for long-term care. Long-term care costs in the United States currently average somewhere between $54,000 and over $100,000 per year, depending on the level of care required. Without a plan, those costs frequently fall on adult children, often at exactly the moment when those children are trying to build their own financial position. The conversation is uncomfortable. Having it anyway is one of the most financially protective things you can do for both generations. With the foundation defended and the plan protected, there's one final thing worth stepping back to look at. Not another move, but the pattern underneath all of them, and what it actually means for where you go from here. Here's what all of this actually comes down to. The gap between the two financial outcomes available to someone at 40 isn't explained by income, luck, or whether the market cooperated. It's explained by a sequence, a small number of structural decisions made in a specific order that compound differently than everything else. Track the right scoreboard. Net worth, not income. Eliminate the costs that drain silently. Consumption debt. A weak credit profile. No cash reserve. Build skills that the market can't easily replace or cap. Find exposure to upside you actually own. Then protect everything you've built before something outside the plan arrives to test it. Those aren't tips, they're mechanisms. Each one changes the trajectory of the next. The place to start is the one that feels most uncomfortable right now. Not the most interesting, not the easiest, the one you've been putting off. That's usually the one doing the most damage in the background. One question worth carrying forward. If salary and equity produce completely different financial outcomes over a lifetime, why does almost every piece of mainstream financial advice treat them as interchangeable? That's a thread worth pulling. And it's exactly what the next video is about.